Man, it is good to be with you guys. If I haven't met you yet, my name is Jonathan. I'm the student pastor here on staff. It's a joy to be with you guys today. And as we've kind of mentioned, we are really entering into the summer months, which means graduation is right around the corner for a lot of our seniors, which is super exciting. And as we've gotten closer to graduation, it reminded me a little bit more of my graduation. And that was a joyous day, one, because I was done with high school, and that was a blessing in and of itself. But the second reason is because I was super excited for what I got to do after high school. I was joining a gap year discipleship program called the Joshua Wilderness Institute. It was 12 months long at this cabin, or not that cabin, at this camp that really impacted my life. And I was so excited. And looking back on that year, there is no doubt in my mind that it was the single most transformative year of my life. The place, the people, the community, the spiritual disciplines, the serving that we all did together truly shaped me more than anything else I had ever experienced before that, and really since then. And I remember going to this program that was not as simple as I thought it would be, because the biggest concern was that my parents were kind of convinced that I may or may not have been joining a cult at the time. Yeah, and honestly, the more I look back, I'm like, they had some good reasons. I was at this weird camp for 12 months. I only had certain days I was allowed to come home. I had to sign a covenant. Like, there are all these weird things, but I was like really dedicated. I was passionate, and my parents eventually were like, all right, like we'll sign off on it, like you can go. And I was like, great. I show up to this program, 55 other young adults. I meet some of them, and it was funny because some of their parents also thought that they were joining a cult. And I was like, wow, we're all in this together. And then we were like, wow, like the amount of parents that just were like, you know what, you might be joining a cult. All right, go for it anyway, was just shocking to all of us. We're like, wow, there's a lot of us. But because we were talking about it, I was like, you know what, maybe I should just double check. Let me Google if there's any cult-like activity. So I Googled Joshua Wilderness Institute, and the first Google fill in the blank search was cult activity ? And I was like, ooh, that's concerning. Let's hit that one. So I looked on it, and the first link that comes up was no recent cult-like activity. I was like, great. Took a screenshot, sent it to my mom. Fun fact, Amy was not hyped about that text message. She was like, look, Jonathan, this is exactly what they would want the internet to say if you were joining a cult. And I was like, you got me there. That was good. But a couple months go by, and everything's kind of going fine. And I'm like calling my parents, and I just had this great idea. I was like, you know what? I should just make, a classic cult joke. That's always funny. Fun fact, teenagers, never funny to try to convince your parents that you've joined a cult. It will end poorly every time. But I called my parents. They didn't pick up. So I left this voicemail, laughing to myself the whole time. I left this voicemail. I was like, hey, mom and dad, I love you guys, miss you. Just wanted you to know, man, I've just been so enlightened by this program. My mind has just been opened up to so many new cool things, and I cannot wait to come home and share with you guys because I feel like it'll lighten your life too. Love you. Bye. I hang up the phone, laugh to myself, ha ha ha, this is great, and I go on about my day. 3 days later, my sister messages me, and she's like, hey, are you okay? I was like, yeah, dude, I'm fine. Why? And she's like, because look, we will come up there and break you out right now. I'll get Lucas, we'll get in the car, we're driving up. It's like a 5-hour drive from my house. And they're like, we'll come get you right now. Are you good? And I was like, dude, Corey, I'm fine. It's okay. It was a joke of a voicemail. Don't worry about it. And her response was, that's exactly what they would want you to say if you had joined a cult. And I was like, all right, I just can't win with my family anymore. I was like, look, I'm not in a cult. I'm fine. Get over it. Rest of the year goes by, no culty things happened. We all made it out. My parents now look back on that year and agree that was a really great program and decision for you. But it was just so funny, the whole process of getting there. But I remember showing up day one, meeting all these other young adults, and they are just some of the best young adult Christian people I had just ever met in my life at that time. I'm showing up to this program 6 months into following Jesus, really new to this whole Jesus thing. And they're all showing in with years of experience, being a part of a church and a youth group, a community. They had scripture memorized. They had all these really great powerful experiences with service and prayer and convictions that God had spoken to them, just so many of them. And I was just sitting there a couple weeks in being oh my gosh, I think I made a horrible mistake because I don't measure up to anybody here. Like, I don't have any scripture memorized. I've actually only read like one page of the Bible, I think, on my own. Like, I just don't have these experiences. I have like one conviction in my life that I should be working on, like all of these things. And I just felt like I did not measure up. And as people, we just have this tendency to measure ourselves against each other, right? We want to measure, we want to know, okay, who's like the most successful, and we'll measure it based off their salaries or their job titles. We want to know who's the strongest, and so we'll measure it against their bench press or their squat or their deadlifts. We want to know like who's the smartest, and we'll measure it against like, hey, what colleges did they get into? What was your GPA? And so we have all these ways as people in which we measure each other and we measure ourselves. And we do it so efficiently that sometimes we don't even realize it. Like, man, I'll meet somebody and I'm like, oh, you drive a Mercedes? Boom, measured. Okay, I know exactly where I fit like in the standard. Oh, you own a house? Okay, measured. Great, I know where I stand. You go on what vacations? Okay, measured. I got it. I know exactly where I stand and where I lie within you. And so as people, we have this powerful and natural tendency to measure and to compare. And when we continue to let this be one of the defining factors of who we are, we continue to breed sins like envy and jealousy and greed. It just continues and continues to form. But the problem is that we do it. Whether we realize it or not, whether we'll acknowledge it or not, whether we admit it or not, we do this. And so my question for you is, how are you measuring what is a good Christian and what is not? Like, how do you measure who is a good follower of Jesus and who isn't? And I bet if I asked you, like, hey, who is the most, like, faithful follower of Jesus that you know, that there's somebody who's going to come to mind. And that just shows us, like, okay, I've measured that person above everybody else. I have measured them and said they are the most faithful. Like, they're the ones I want to be like. And it's because we have these measurements. And so what is it for you? Maybe it's, hey, how often are you reading the scriptures? What kind of, like, prayer life do you have? How, like, in tune with you are with the Spirit? Where do you serve? How often are you going to church? Like, we will make all these measurements of what it means to be a good Christian and what is not. And as we go through this series, Everyday Faith, through the book of James, James is going to be very clear, and he's going to be very direct, and he's going to be very straightforward on a lot of things. And one of those things is, what are the correct measurements for a follower of Jesus? And so if you have a Bible, I want to encourage you to open up to James chapter 1. I'm going to start reading here in verse 19. It says this: "My dear brothers and sisters, understand this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. For human anger does not accomplish God's righteousness." Man, and even we could pause there. And if that's all we took away from like the book of James, that we would be people who are quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger, man, how powerful of a testimony of that life would that be to the people around us? Especially as we head into an election season, especially as there's already all this tension being built up. And we as people of God are being like, hey, I am quick to listen and I am slow to speak and I am slow to anger. That is what I'm known for. And even if you're like, man, that just feels like unattainable, just imagine, who wouldn't want this person as their neighbor? Who wouldn't want this person as their boss or as their teacher? Who wouldn't want this person as a significant other? If this is all we took away, how powerful would it be? But verse 21 continues, saying, "Therefore, ridding yourself of all moral filth and evil that is so prevalent, humbly receive the implanted word, which is able to save your souls." And so I love this verse. I love the way James starts, because his first thing is like, hey, everyone understand, you got to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. And it's moments like these, it's passages like these that really encourage me and remind me, okay, the first century church was not better than the rest of us. Just because they lived closer to Jesus didn't mean they had it all figured out. Doesn't mean they were better at following his commands and his teachings. They are struggling with the same things that we are struggling 2,000 years later with. And James encourages us to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. And he says this because human anger does not accomplish God's righteousness. And I think that this reminder is really important for us to remember. Because what James is saying is not that necessarily human anger is bad or evil, right? We see God angry throughout Scripture, so we know that it is a holy emotion, that there is righteousness found in it. But human anger tends to and leads to a lot of sin pretty consistently. It's not the easiest emotion to consistently control, to glorify and honor God. And the Israelites at this time are still being oppressed by Rome, and they're still being abused by Rome. And so this idea of like, maybe if I just like, this is God's anger and I could use this to like fulfill God's promise is what a lot of Israelites were thinking. One commentator named Craig Keener, he says it this way: the militant Jewish resistance emphasized striking out at the Romans and their aristocratic vassals, supposing that they would be acting as agents of God's righteousness, righteous indignation. But James associates righteousness with peace and with non-resistance. Man, this is the call that James is saying. He's, hey, if your anger becomes your driving emotion and your driving force as you follow Jesus and maybe trying to lead other people to Jesus, he's saying your anger will not lead to God's righteousness. Instead, he says, therefore, ridding yourself of all moral filth, so the evil that is prevalent, humbly receive the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. And I love this because James offers a very clear picture that to some extent, as followers of Jesus, we have a responsibility and we are active in our faith. He is calling his readers to be active in ridding themselves of moral filth. And this word moral filth is really just a big, like all-encompassing word for sin. Anything that does not reflect the image of God that God has created you in, he is saying, hey, be active in getting rid of that. So we are active in getting rid of the materialism, our pride. We are active in getting rid of greed and pornography. We are active in getting rid of gluttony and hate and racism. There is an active part of our faith that we are called to participate in. And on the flip side of that, James then says, but humbly receive the implanted word which is able to save your souls. And so there is this passiveness in our faith. This word for receive is like the same root word for hospitality. It's the idea that we just open up the doors of our lives and we let this word come in and change us and save us. And it's not based off our deeds. It's not based off of our actions. It's not based off of what we have or have not done. It is truly a gift that we have received. It reminds me a lot of my family growing up. We would be the ones that would host Christmas dinner for our extended family. And so Christmas season was great up until the 22nd, 3 days before. And that's when our house stopped becoming a house. It turned into a fortress. Amy became General Amy, and me and my siblings became the fun foot soldiers that had to deep clean every square inch of this home. For 3 long days, all we did was clean. I'm pretty sure my memories of Christmas are more about cleaning than they are about presents. Like, that is just how intense the cleaning was. To the point where, like, you get like Christmas Eve, and I was like, I don't even think I want to sit on the couch. I don't want to get yelled at. I don't want to get in trouble. Like, I don't want to mess it up. Like, I'll just lie on the floor in the garage. Like, I'm good. Like, just don't make me clean anything else again. But the whole point of this time of cleaning was so that on Christmas Day, we could open our doors, we could humbly receive our family, and then our place would be ready. And it's kind of the same idea here, but luckily for us, Jesus is not sitting on the outside of our house waiting for it to get clean before he enters. Jesus will enter into the dirtiest of homes, the most sin-filled of lives, and he will come in as a humble word that we receive, and he will save our souls, no questions asked. And while he's there, he will start to point out the areas in which we can clean up. I remember being 18, just starting to follow Jesus. I had this great encounter with God. I had no idea what to do with it afterwards. I paid zero attention in youth group. That's my own problem. But I had no idea what to do. And so I was trying to figure out what's my next step? Like, how do I follow Jesus? And the only thing that I felt, the only conviction that I felt strongly about was God saying, hey, you have to control your tongue. Me and my friends in high school just had the worst mouths possible. Every other word was a swear word. It was unnecessary for anybody to speak the way that we spoke. But I just felt this conviction of, man, it's going to be really hard for me to glorify God with me talking like this. This is the one thing that I need to change. And that didn't happen, like, I didn't have to stop swearing and then Jesus came and saved me. It was a result of Jesus entering into my life and this conviction that he said, hey, you need to control your tongue. And so God is going to enter in and he's going to control our tongue. He's going to ask us. And so the passage goes on. In verse 22, it says this, but be doers of the word and not only hearers, deceiving yourselves. Because if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like someone looking at his own face in a mirror, for he looks at himself and he goes away and immediately forgets what kind of person he was. But the one who looks intently into the perfect law of freedom and perseveres in it and is not forgetful hearer, but a doer who works, this person will be blessed in what he does. So far in this passage, James has made it clear, hey, there is a word. It will save you. You humbly receive it. And now his call is, now that you've received that word, don't just hear the word. Don't deceive yourself. Be a doer of the word. Be active in the faith. And to get this point across, he tells like a small parable. And I love this moment because if you look in the Gospels, there's this moment where Mary and all the brothers and sisters of Jesus, and James there as well, they come to Jesus and they try to get him to stop teaching. They thought he was going to die, that he was going to get himself killed, so they try to get him to be quiet. They didn't believe anything that he was teaching. And now we fast forward years later, and here is James, not only now a believer in his brother Jesus, and not only a teacher of Jesus' new followers, but he's teaching in the same way that Jesus has taught his disciples through stories and parables. It's this beautiful redemption story we see in James just through a couple of verses. But James tells the story of somebody who looks at a mirror and forgets what they look like, and so they go on, versus somebody who intently looks at the mirror and they remember who they are. And I just remember hearing this story and just thinking, this doesn't make any sense. Like, what kind of person, how does a person look at themselves in a mirror and then forget who they are? Like, that is mind-blowing to me. There's no way that that's what's happening. And the more that I kind of studied this passage, the more it became clearer and clearer that people in the ancient Near East world just did not have mirrors in the way that we do. Like, we have mirrors everywhere. We always know what we look like. But only the richest of the rich people had mirrors in ancient Israel, and they were made out of bronze, so they weren't nearly as good as what we have today. But people in Israel, they just truly didn't know what they looked like. And for some of them, that was a really good thing. Let's just be honest. But for a lot of them, they just didn't have this skill. They didn't have practice. They didn't know what they looked like. So if they just quickly glanced in the mirror, it'd be very easy for them to forget what they looked like and who they were. And so James is writing this saying, hey, if you don't have any practice looking at yourself in the mirror, you're going to forget who you are. In the same way that if you don't have any practice, like looking at the scripture, looking at the stories of Jesus, looking at his person, you're going to forget how to be a doer of the word. Instead, be the person who intently looks, they stoop down, they fix their gaze, they study the mirror so that when they leave, they know who they are. In the same way, be people who look at the life of Jesus, study him intently, follow the stories so that when the situations come up, we will naturally be a doer of the word and not just a hearer. It's why on Sunday mornings we make such a time to study scripture and to be together. It's because we want to know who we are. We want to study the word. And so James makes it clear, he uses this metaphor, and then he says, if you do this, like that person will be blessed in what he does. And I love this because I don't think that this is one of those blessings of like, hey, if you study the word, then like everything's going to go really well for you. I think this is a direct callback to earlier in the chapter when James says, hey, blessed are those who go through trials. Like the more that you study Jesus, the more that you become a doer of the word, like you're going to be blessed, and it's not a blessing through comfort, it's a blessing through trials. The more that we follow Jesus, the more that the trials are going to come, and the more blessed that we're going to be by them. But James moves on. He has now made it clear, here's the word. Okay, be a doer of the word, be active in your faith. And then he says this in verse 26, and if anyone thinks he is religious without controlling his tongue, his religion is useless and he deceives himself. Pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself unstained from the world. And so I think this passage ends in a way that we all or a lot of people naturally tend to flinch with. We're like, religion? No, what? Relationship. Like I'm in a relationship with God. Like that's what our faith is. Our faith isn't a religion. And to an extent, that is true. Like by the power of Jesus, we have a personal relationship with the triune God. Thank God for that. And yet we are also part of a religious group who worships a God who has a faith, who has standards. And so James is making it clear, hey, this is a religion. And he says, and if you want to defile your religion most, then don't control your tongue. He says a defiled religion is someone who does not control their tongue. He's making it very clear. The way that we talk matters. What we say matters. The way that we talk about people when they're there versus when they're not there matters. The way that we talk about our friends and our family matters. The way that we talk about our faith, it matters. It's verses like these that just make my experience as an 18-year-old so much more convicting. Of being like, I've never read the book of James. I had no idea that this was a call of God, that this was a standard. But the first thing that Jesus called me to do was to watch my mouth. because the way that we talk matters. Jesus says it this way in Luke chapter 6, verses 45. He says, a good person produces good out of the good stored up in his heart, and an evil person produces evil out of the evil stored up in his heart. For his mouth speaks from the overflow of the heart. The way that we talk deeply reflects our relationship and our religion and our faith in Jesus. So James is making it clear, anyone who thinks they're religious and they do not control their tongue, their religion is useless. That doesn't mean anything. But then he goes on and says, okay, if you do want an undefiled religion, you want a faith that is strong and follows Jesus and is intentional, he tells you to do two things. He says this, to look after the orphans and the widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. Orphans and widows were some of the lowest, most forgotten people in the Roman society. And James has already promised each and every one of us, hey, you're going to go through trials, like you're going to go through times of distress. And his call for all the followers of Jesus for a faithful religion is saying, hey, when you see people who are forgotten and alone, like do not let them go through their trials alone. Care for the orphans and the widows. Be with them. Do not neglect them. It is not a call for us to do this by ourselves. We are called to do this together. And then he says, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. He says to care for how you are personally, with what you've done, with how you live, so that the culture of the world does not transform you or stain you in a way that does not reflect Jesus. So James has made it clear. Here's the word saves you. You humbly receive it. So you need to be a doer of the word. And what is a doer of the word? It's somebody who cares for the orphans or for the widows and keeps themselves unstained. Another way of saying this is a doer of the word recognizes that our faith is not an individual activity alone, but is a communal response to the trials around us. That our faith is not an individual activity alone, but it is a communal response to the trials around us. So if we go back to the question that we asked earlier of like, hey, what do you measure as a good Christian and what do you not? If all of our responses are just personal things that we do, time I spend in scripture, when I go to church, like what small group I am in, like how I fast, how I pray, then we have missed a big key part of following Jesus. And if only the answers that we gave were being like people who just serve others and people who are just out in the community, then we've missed a really key part of following Jesus. It is both an individual activity and a communal response to the trials around us. And so if you're kind of coming in today and you're like, hey, you know what? I've heard the word and I've received it, and maybe I haven't been a doer, but I want to be a doer. I want to act out my faith. I want to live that life that Jesus has called us to. What do I do? Do I need to go to the orphanage? Like, do I need to start adopting kids? Like, what's my next step? And I think there are two ways that you can act this out. The first is to make time to be away from the world. Like, make time to where the world is like, you're constantly in it, but you're going to have to make time to get yourself away so that you can focus on your relationship and your faith in Jesus. Be in prayer, be in scripture, be in a small group, things that you can do to help keep you unstained from the world around us. And if you're wondering, hey, how do you like know if you're stained? Like, how do you know if the world's already starting to affect you? I think one of the biggest and most telling signs is when we convince ourselves, I just don't have time right now to like focus on faith or on Jesus. Like maybe once this season of work is over, maybe once these things clear up, maybe once that thing is off my plate, like then I'll have the time to pursue Jesus. And our world is constantly going to be telling us, hey, there's more on your plate. There's always more to do. You never have time. And it's one of the clearest signs that our faith has been stained by the world if we have convinced ourselves that I do not have the time for Jesus. So if you're like, hey, I want to be unstained, the first thing to do is to make time to be away from the world. The second thing is to make time or to sacrifice your time to serve someone else. Make time or sacrifice to serve someone else. James is clear. Care for the orphans and widows. They are lost, they are forgotten, they are ignored by everybody else in society except us. We're going to care for them. And there are still countless people in our world and in Gig Harbor all around us who are lost and who are forgotten and who just need somebody to care for them. So would you consider being a part and serving at the Tacoma Rescue Mission? Would you help at Camp Stand By Me? Would you be a part of the furniture bank? Would you serve with our children? Would you be a teenager small group leader? Like when we have to make time or sacrifice time, meaning I'm giving up something that I want to do for the sake of serving somebody else, that is the call that James has put on his followers and on his readers. And so make time to be away from the world and make time or sacrifice time to serve someone else. And I think that these things, if this is what we start to do, if this is how we start to follow Jesus, this will be the most powerful testimony for those who, when they hear the word Christianity, when they hear about like evangelical Christians, all they think are hate, and they think of politics and think of judgment. When that's what they think of, and we start to show them saying, no, I'm just here to care for the lost and for the lonely, for the people who can't care for themselves. Hey, I just have this coworker, and I know they're going through a hard season right now. They're in a trial. I'm not going to leave them alone. I'm just going to check in. I'm going to make sure they're doing okay. Hey, I just have a friend, I have a neighbor who I know is going through some hard times. I'm just going to check in. I'm just going to care for the person who needs to be cared for. And they start to ask, man, why? It's like, this is exactly what Jesus has called me to do. He's called me to care for those who aren't caring for themselves, who can't. Man, like, how are you so different? It says I also take time to care for myself. I also make sure that there is a part of me that is just separate from the world, that is not just being influenced by everything on social media and technology and life. Like, I'm making sure that there's a part of me that's set aside for me and for Jesus. It keeps me healthy so that when I come and serve people, I can serve them well. If this is the story, if this is the testimony, if this is what Gig Harbor starts to see from followers of Jesus at Harbor Covenant Church, I think they would be much more willing and much more likely and much more excited to follow Jesus, knowing that it's not just about hate or politics. Man, it's about we care for ourselves and we care for others. Like, that's what James sums it into. And so as we end our time today, I want to ask you 3 questions. And the first is this: what is the sin that you need to be more active in ridding from yourself? What is the sin that you need to be more active in ridding from yourself? The second question is this: where are you currently serving and caring for others, especially those who are mistreated? Where are you making the time? Where are you sacrificing the time? And the last is this: how are you creating a space to be unstained by the world? How are you creating a space for you and Jesus to meet, to stay in that relationship, and to be healthy?
Hi, thanks for watching. The people of Harbor Covenant Church really want you to know the love that God has for you, want to grow with you in faith, and want to serve alongside you, not only to help others do the same, but also to make our families and our communities better. If that sounds like something that you can get on board with, then like, follow, and drop us a comment in the video. Watch some more videos on our channel or come visit us on Sunday. You can find out more about Harbor Covenant Church at harborcov.church.